right, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Scott said, I did grow up in the church, and there's much about this actual church building, this setting, that reminds me of my childhood. And so it's good to take a quick trip down memory road just to be here, even though I grew up in Michigan. If I could, I'd just like to start with a quick story this morning, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about my grandfather. My grandfather was a very large man. He's taller than me. He had these really enormous hands. He was a plumber. He was a soldier. He fought in the wars. But he lived in Colorado. We lived in Michigan. But I always loved to go visit with him. In the summer, we would take a trip out to Denver, Colorado, and he would build forts with us. We'd climb trees. We'd pick apples. He always wanted to hold up his hands to see if our hands were as big as his now. He always wanted to kind of shadow box because when he was in the service, he was a boxer. So we always enjoyed our time with him. But as we got older, life gets busier when you're a teenager, and we stopped making the trips to Colorado, and they started making trips to Michigan to see us. And sometime around when I was in middle school, those visits started to change. We noticed that my grandfather would ask us questions about our lives, my brother and I, my older brother. And he would want to catch up on what was happening with us. He would ask us about our jobs. He would ask us about basketball, things like that, things of great importance. And several minutes later, he would ask us again. And we were confused by this because we had just answered the question, and we were 13, 14-year-old boys who really don't know much about life, even though they think they do. And we would look at my dad, and my dad would say, you have to speak up. You're not answering. When you answer, you're not speaking loudly enough. He doesn't hear well. So if you'll just speak up, he will hear you, and he won't ask you those same questions again. So we'd turn up the volume a bit, and we would answer more loudly, but he would continue to ask the same questions over and over. He came back the next year, and he's asking the same questions, repeating himself quite a bit, and we tried speaking up, and we looked at my dad, and he just says, well, here's the thing. You got to speak more loudly. And we said, we're speaking really loud, Dad. It's not working. And he says, well, here's the other thing is, he's asking the question, and before you answer, he's lost his attention. He's looking away, and he's moved on to something else. So when he asks you the question, try to make sure you hold his attention, then answer the question, and he won't keep asking you the same questions over and over again. So we would do that. We would speak loudly. We would try to hold his attention, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The things that we told him about our lives, he just couldn't keep up with, and he couldn't seem to hold the information. So we tried every explanation that we could. It was his hearing or it was his attention. Just couldn't really figure it out. We didn't understand. And frankly, I don't think my dad did either. So if we fast forward a few years, I'm now a junior in college. And I'm at Calvin College, and it was a very cold January morning. I still remember my toes feeling frostbitten while I sat in my writing short fiction class. And there was a knock at the door, and the professor stepped out, and he called me out soon after that. And that was a strange thing. That's the kind of thing that typically happens in high school, where you get called out of class by the principal, but I got called out by the professor. And what he said to me was, you need to call your dad right away because your grandfather has disappeared, and they don't know where he is. So the thing you need to know about my grandfather was he was a retired plumber, but one thing he loved to do each week, every Tuesday, he would drive into downtown Denver to a not very nice neighborhood, and he would go to a meeting of retired plumbers, and they would spend time together. And that was a great social outlet for him. It was good for him. But this time he drove downtown, and he didn't come back. We actually don't know if he made it to the meeting or not, but we know he left the house, and when it came darkness, night fell, he hadn't returned, and we feared the worst. And again, all that we thought that was wrong with him was that he couldn't hear very well, and he wasn't paying attention when you answered his questions. So there was a big search. We called the police. There were no silver alerts or gray alerts like you would get on your phone now. So you've got to call the police. My dad flies into Denver. His brother drives down from the mountains, and they're searching the city, looking anywhere they can find their father who has disappeared. So the story ends somewhat well. The next day, they got a phone call from the sheriff in a small town in Kansas called Birdsong, Kansas. And you don't need to know a lot about Birdsong, Kansas, except it's about 300 miles from Denver. And what happened was, somewhere between my grandfather leaving his home in Denver and the next morning, was that he pulled up to a little farmhouse. He parked his car, he walked inside, found a nice recliner, sat down, and he fell asleep. And there was an older lady who lived there by herself. She heard the door open and shut. She thought, that seems strange, I live here alone. And she walks in and sees an older man sitting there asleep in the recliner. Calls the police. They figure out who he is, call my grandmother, and make the connection. So the reason why I tell this story is because it's not a story of hearing, it's not a story of attention. This is a story about Alzheimer's disease. And what he was experiencing early on in those middle school years, when he was asking that question over and over again, was he was experiencing the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and we simply didn't recognize it. And even if we did recognize it, we really wouldn't admit it. And the reason why I like the story is not just because it's of my grandfather, somebody who I loved and looked up to, is it demonstrates something really difficult about Alzheimer's disease, in that it's very tricky to recognize in the early stages. And even when we recognize it, there's something so fearful and terrifying about it that we don't want to admit it when it's actually happening. So today, obviously, we're going to talk a lot about Alzheimer's disease. And whenever I do this, I'm always very thankful that you've come. Each of you that you're here, that you would come and hear something about Alzheimer's is something very near and dear to my heart. But I have to give you the disclaimer up front that we're going to talk about some difficult things. Right? So we're going to spend the first section of this morning, we're going to take a break about midway. And the first part, we're just going to talk about some of the basics of Alzheimer's disease, about what's going on and what we can do about it. But I hope what we'll do is no one will leave during the break, because the second part we're going to get to discussing how do we make a difference and how do we minister to people who are affected and families who are affected by Alzheimer's disease. And hopefully we can find some hope in what is a very difficult condition. So this is what we're going to set out to do today. I talk a little bit about what Alzheimer's is, how do we make the diagnosis. I want to spend a good amount of time talking about strengths and weaknesses in memory functioning, and then how can we help care for people and families affected by Alzheimer's. So I want to start with the basics, because if I don't answer this first question, somebody will ask me. No one's asked me yet today, but somebody asks me every time I do anything related to Alzheimer's disease. What's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? Or when I'm in clinic, people will tell me he doesn't really have Alzheimer's, he just has a little bit of dementia. So if we could go forward. Dementia is simply the broad category, and I know some of you already know this, but dementia describes a series of cognitive thinking changes that happen later in life that are severe enough that they interfere with daily functioning. So we all experience some amount of forgetting, some amount of cognitive change as we get older, but that's often normal aging. And we know it's not normal when it starts to interfere with our basic tasks, remembering to take our medication, our driving ability, as the case with my grandfather, ability to handle finances. It's a significant change, and it interferes with daily life. The forgetting that most people experience in normal aging is something that they can typically compensate for. And in Alzheimer's and dementia, it's much more difficult to compensate. So dementia is the broad category. Alzheimer's disease is one specific type. So the analogy that I like to use is cancer and leukemia. So cancer is the broad category, leukemia is one specific type. Dementia is the broad category, Alzheimer's is one specific type. There are other forms of dementia that are not Alzheimer's, but the vast majority of dementia cases are caused by Alzheimer's disease. 60 to 80% of dementia is Alzheimer's. There are other types that I frankly don't have time to talk about today, but I will be around for questions if you do want to talk about other types. So I want to talk a little bit about what Alzheimer's is, actually a lot bit, not a little, and talk about some of the basic characteristics of Alzheimer's disease. Most of you probably know it's characterized by a gradual onset and progressive worsening of memory problems. So in my grandfather's case, that repetitive questioning reflected an underlying memory problem. He simply couldn't remember that he had already asked that question several minutes ago. And that is one of the hallmark features of Alzheimer's disease, is a very significant memory problem that is very difficult to compensate for with reminding and saying things like, I already told you that. It doesn't make a difference because they don't have a memory for you telling them that. So that's new information to them. These memory changes are caused by some underlying brain changes that we're now learning begin up to 10 to 20 years before the first symptoms of Alzheimer's appear. That to me is absolutely stunning and simultaneously frightening, because what we're talking about are some microscopic changes in the brain that are occurring for many years before people even become forgetful. So here are some of the changes that we see in brains with Alzheimer's disease. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail, but I would like to point out that the information that I'm going to talk about comes from a document called Alzheimer's Disease: Unraveling the Mystery. It's an electronic document you can get free online from the National Institute on Aging. It summarizes the latest research on Alzheimer's disease, and it's updated every year. It's a really fantastic document. So what we see in the first set of brain changes are what we call amyloid plaques. And we're really aware of what these changes are in the brain, but we don't know why they start to happen in the first place. So people who are affected by Alzheimer's disease, just like everyone else, have this normally occurring protein, amyloid precursor protein. It helps a brain cell function normally. For unknown reasons, for people who are affected by Alzheimer's disease, as pictured in the second little bubble there, an enzyme acts upon that protein and snips it into fragments. And those fragments clump together into a sticky deposit that disrupts communication between brain cells and eventually leads those cells to die. So amyloid plaques are the first change. We see them very reliably. We think this is the earliest change in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. The second are tangles. These actually occur within brain cells rather than between. And one thing you need to know is that each brain cell has a series of structures inside called a microtubule. And they are like a little mini train track that runs the distance of a brain cell and transports nutrients so that the cell can function normally. In addition to having the plaques that we just talked about, a second process happens in these brains where a normally occurring protein called tau, for some reason, branches off from that microtubule, and that train track falls apart. And essentially, that brain cell can no longer transport nutrients, and again, you have a second cause of cell death in the people with Alzheimer's disease in their brains. So we have plaques and tangles. We know about them. We don't know why they happen. We believe that the plaques come first and the tangles come second. This is just a quick image I wanted to show you about the progression of the underlying changes in the brain and cognition. The top line there is reflecting the declines that we all experience in terms of normal aging. All of us are declining in terms of our memory and our thinking speed. I look around the room. I don't think anybody here is young enough not to have experienced these yet. And you might say, that doesn't seem right. You don't seem old enough to have, no, it actually starts much earlier than we think. It's harder for us to remember. We think more slowly, even into our 30s. But it's very subtle, and we can compensate. The lower line reflects the trajectory of people with dementia, and there's a long, what we call preclinical period, where those changes are happening in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, but they're functioning normally. So for many years, there was a big debate about whether Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's disease while he was in the White House, right? And the question is not, was he significantly forgetful and had clinically diagnosed dementia? Part of the question was, could he have had the underlying plaques and tangles? The new research suggests that it begins 10, 20 years before the onset of symptoms, and from that perspective, yeah, he probably did have Alzheimer's in his brain. He just didn't have the clinical symptoms yet. I'm not becoming political, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. The point is, the reason why it's so hard to find the earliest symptoms is that process is at work in the brain, and you don't have one day where suddenly you become very forgetful. It comes on so gradually that we have a hard time even agreeing when it began. Go ahead. So as people live longer with Alzheimer's disease, the more these plaques and tangles spread. There are 3 brains pictured here. You probably can't in the back see the blue shading. The upper left is early Alzheimer's disease. The plaques and tangles are mainly in an area called the temporal lobes, which if you were to turn sideways, they're inside your skull, right around where your ear is. These are key memory centers in the brain, and we'll talk more about memory in a moment. Middle stages of Alzheimer's are in the upper right. You see the blue has started to spread to other areas of the brain. And this bottom brain is a late stage Alzheimer's brain where the plaques and tangles really have spread throughout. So as people live longer with it, the brain damage accumulates over time. I have to warn you, the next 2 slides are going to be pictures of brains. So if you're queasy about seeing that kind of thing, I've warned you, and you can look away. If you go to the next one. So this is a comparison of a normally aging brain and a brain with Alzheimer's disease. What you see in that brain with Alzheimer's disease is significant shrinkage or atrophy of the brain tissue. So you've got these plaques and tangles that are essentially leading to cell death in neurons, brain cells, and that brain tissue actually shrinks. It's like the atrophy of a muscle, but it's caused by a specific disease process. You could go to the next one, Scott. This is just a different image of a very advanced Alzheimer's brain on the right, healthy brain on the left. Part of the reason why I think this is so important for us to recognize, and some of you may have known this already, is that when Alzheimer's is first starting in our lives, we have a tendency to think that somebody is just being difficult, or they're not trying very hard, or there's some reason why they're acting this way. And it's a good reminder for us to come back and say, look, when we look at the brains of people who are significantly affected by Alzheimer's disease, there is very real neurobiological damage happening that provides context in helping us understand their behavior. Okay. So again, I said today that we would start with the bad news, and we are in the thick of it already. So I hope you'll hang with me, but I think this is the important part that we need to make sure we understand. So as people live longer, it's a progressive condition. It continues to get worse. So the memory and the cognitive changes get worse. So with my grandfather, obviously he started with just some repetitive questioning, which was difficult enough, but he got to that point where he didn't really know where he was. And when he got lost, there was no way he was going to find his own way back. And when they finally got him in Birdsong, Kansas, and asked him what in the world he was doing, he had no explanation for why he was there or what he was doing. We've tried to go back and in our minds sort of reconstruct what was he trying to do. And we think maybe he was headed for South Dakota, which is where he grew up, or maybe he thought it looked like South Dakota and he became disoriented. I'm not sure. Go ahead. So what starts as forgetting in those earlier stages spreads to other areas of our functioning. Difficulty finding the right words to say. People will have problems with their communication, with their problem solving, doing familiar tasks, forgetting where they put things. So it's very common for people with Alzheimer's disease to not know where they put their purse or their wallet. And that happens to all of us, I want to reassure you. But they're more likely to have no memory for where they put it and then start to feel that somebody must have taken it from them. And that is another behavioral challenge. Getting lost, confusion about time or place. You could go to the next one. So here's the second to last piece of bad news, is that the current treatments that we have for Alzheimer's disease really can't stop the process. And when I say the process, I mean that spread of plaques and tangles in the brains and the worsening of memory and functioning. So people are really facing continuing decline and more dependence upon other people to help them with some of the tasks that they used to do for themselves. So a little bit about medication. I am just a lowly psychologist. I'm not a physician, but I want to summarize what the research says about the medications for Alzheimer's disease. There are multiple FDA-approved medications that you can take for Alzheimer's disease. And there's a lot of debate if you read it closely. And the reason why there is debate is that everybody agrees that they don't reverse the symptoms. Right? So this is a different kind of medication treatment. This isn't like when you get an infection and you go take an antibiotic and it takes care of the infection and you no longer deal with it anymore. It also isn't like when you get a diagnosis of high blood pressure and you take the medication and it normalizes your blood pressure. Really what you're doing is taking a medication that's designed to boost a particular brain chemical called acetylcholine, and that's involved in learning and memory. It's a great idea. But these medications are not designed, nor are they capable of affecting the spread of plaques and tangles. That was never the goal of that type of medication. We're really trying to boost a particular chemical that should help with memory. What most people will conclude is the second point. So the medications don't reverse the symptoms, but they provide a modest benefit for a period of time for some people. So some people feel like they're really helpful for them, other people really don't notice much. There are some trials that are published that have shown a difference and others that show no difference at all. So the question is, should I take them or not? I can't give you medical advice on whether you take medicine, but I would say if it were me or if it were my wife or my parents, I would definitely try them, because if I could get any benefit out of them, I definitely would give it a shot. The other thing that I want to mention, though, is from a perspective of boosting acetylcholine, this learning and memory chemical in the brain, is all these medicines are designed to boost that, and many of us take medications that simultaneously lower that same brain chemical. So there's a list of medications here on this Aging Brain Care site, which is a site out of Indianapolis where they track some potentially harmful or negative effects of medications on cognition. So even something as simple as an antihistamine sometimes can lower levels of acetylcholine. So one of the things that we encourage people to do when they've got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is talk with their physician about the medicines that they're taking to see if any of them could be removed that might help them function a bit better. Don't go off the medication without talking to your doctor. Next one. Okay, so we're talking about a very difficult disease, and we're talking about one that is incredibly widespread. People are starting to talk about Alzheimer's disease as the defining disease of the baby boomer generation. So we currently have about 5 million people in the United States living with Alzheimer's disease, and it's anticipated that if you're a baby boomer, you'll either spend a good portion of your aging years either taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's disease or experiencing the symptoms yourself. It's expected that the numbers will continue to rise. So as our society grows older, we see many more cases of Alzheimer's disease. Age is one of the most consistent risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. It's a huge load that's carried by family caregivers, and obviously a tremendous amount of healthcare costs. So again, I know we just had an election yesterday. Regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican or what type of healthcare system and insurance you want, you can be sure that if we don't figure out what we're doing with Alzheimer's disease, that it could bankrupt our system by 2050. And we currently have no cure for Alzheimer's disease. We don't know when it's coming. I'm hopeful that it will be soon. But at the same time, there are many people living with Alzheimer's disease who need our best care efforts right now. So sometimes I'll get asked, when should you ask for an evaluation? I know many of you work at Phoebe or work in other care settings, but I know that many of you, I don't know, but I suspect that many of you are doing double duty. You not only care for somebody professionally, but you may care for somebody personally as well. So I just want to give you a few thoughts on when to ask for an evaluation. So anytime there's a clear change from prior levels of functioning, anytime there's a rapid change, is definitely worth a call to your physician. If it's getting worse, if you have a family history of memory problems, those are all things that push you more toward talking with your doctor about getting an evaluation. You go to the next one. What does the assessment involve? Typically, best case scenario, you should have a full history and physical by your physician. They should describe or try to best understand the onset of the symptoms, when they began, how they progressed. They should draw some blood and take some urine to screen for reversible causes of those changes. They may do some brain imaging to look for other causes of changes in memory and cognition, thinking skills. And you could go one more. Some people get neuropsych testing, which is what I do, which is where I'll sit you down for several hours and basically take your brain for a test drive to see where it's working well and where it's not. We'll try the radio, we'll try the brakes, turn signals, test your memory, your communication, your concentration. And really what we're trying to do is take a very in-depth look of how you're functioning for your age and education level. Frankly, no one really wants to come to see me for neuropsych testing. It's not because I'm a bad person, but this is not a fun thing. And if you've ever had somebody sit you down and test you to see where the limits of your memory were, it's really uncomfortable. You feel very put on the spot. A medication review is something I would recommend, but not everybody gets that. So I want to just mention a bit about cognitive screening, because I think it's something that many of us can do to try to better improve our detection. And cognitive screening is just a series of brief tasks that we give to people to help determine who needs more evaluation. So oftentimes I'll get asked by people, what's our first step really to figure out whether we need some sort of assessment or whether you might be experiencing dementia yourself. And cognitive screening is a really quick and dirty way to get that sense of what might be going on. It's not a diagnosis, it's just to determine who needs more testing. So if we could go to the next one. I just want to mention actually, could you step one more back? One of the reasons why it's really important is that in the earliest stages, no one is really going to walk up to you and say, it's rare actually, that people are going to walk up and say they're having trouble with their memory. And it's going to be even more rare that you can just tell in casual conversation, because people can cover very well, people maintain their social graces for many years, and so a cognitive screening measure can help you figure out whether they need more testing or not. Go ahead. So I'm just going to mention a few of them very briefly. You can just skip to the next one. I'm going to go through this. Many people will get the MMSE. If you work in a care setting, you probably are familiar with this test. It's been around for many years. You get a score from 0 to 30. 30 is better, 0 is worse. And you get a variety of different types of tasks, time orientation, some brief memory tasks, some working memory types of things. It's fine. Go to the next one. People get a score that reflects a range of functioning. So if you use this test, oftentimes people will consider it to be a normal score, 24 and higher. You could go to the next one. It is something that we use very often. We've used it for many years. It's a common metric for people to communicate with one another about where they're at, and it's useful for tracking changes over time. You could go to the next one. But the drawbacks is very heavily influenced by your level of education. So if you are highly educated, you'll do better on this test, and if you stopped going to school earlier, you'll do worse. So my grandfathers, both of them, were done with school by 7th grade, and that influences how you perform on that type of a task. There are also cultural differences, and in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease, it doesn't do a very good job of detecting the earliest changes. Go ahead. So I want to talk about some others. So at some point, if you're screening, somebody may ask you to draw a clock. My parents are nearing their 70s, and when they come to visit me now, they want to talk about cognitive screening measures because they're starting to get them, because now Medicare will pay for them in an annual wellness visit. So they get screened every year, and they rehearse in between times what the screening is going to involve. And I told them that's not the point, but I also told them now I know if you fail one that you really are starting to have some difficulty because you're practicing. So the first one is clock drawing. It's a very simple, quick and dirty task. You ask somebody to draw a clock, put in all the numbers, and set the time to 10 after 11. You might think that seems really, really easy. How could anybody mix that up? You get 4 points, 1 for a complete circle, 2 for all the numbers, 3 for the numbers in the right spot, and 4 for the correct time. Go ahead. Here's an example of how it can go wrong. This is a person who's pretty far into the dementia process, but this is not uncommon to see, that somebody hears you say, I want you to draw a clock, and when they actually start to do it, they find that it's much more difficult than they thought. And so in the earliest stages, sometimes this will become more difficult for people, even when they still are functioning at a normal level. Next one is another example. This is an example where the person had very poor planning, right? So they started putting in all the numbers, they went 12, and by the time they're in the spot where the 3 is, they're already at 5. And then they had continued to go around. They could recognize that they made a mistake. They tried to erase it, and they couldn't do it. And they just couldn't figure it out, right? And so the point isn't that I see this and I say they have dementia. I say this is a person who failed the screener. This is somebody we need to check out in more detail to see what's going on. Because you might say, well, what if they're just a bad drawer? Well, the further testing will bear that out. Go ahead. This is another test, basically a clock drawing test plus 3-word recalls. So you give somebody 3 words to remember, ask them to draw a clock. When they're done drawing the clock, ask them to repeat the 3 words. Very simple. It's called the Mini-Cog. My parents get this one every year. But the physician uses the same words every year. And they know it. That's a good sign, right? They know the words. So you can skip this. There's multiple ways to fail that. This is a newer one, and they have also gotten this one, they've told me. And they said this one is really hard, and they're right, this is hard. This one is called the MoCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. I highly recommend it because it is very, very sensitive. and the MMSE ranged from 0 to 30, and we said it wasn't sensitive to the early changes. The MoCA is sensitive to early changes, and so it's much more difficult test. You can find it online if you're a healthcare provider, if you want to start doing some screening, mocatest.org. You can find the test there, all the instructions are there, the scoring is there. It's in at least 10 different languages already, but it's very difficult. I'm going to give you some sampling tasks from it. So the first task that you'll do is to connect the dots, alternating between number and letter sequences, 1A, 2B, 3C, etc. It seems very simple, but you're doing it timed. You can draw a cube, three-dimensional cube. You probably don't want to do it as we're going through on this. Drawing a clock is the next task. You go to the next one. This is just a simple naming task, so we've got 3 animals here. All I would ask you to do is just say the name of what they are. So I won't ask anybody to try it, but we've got a lion, a rhino, and a camel. Interestingly enough, we've done some research with this test, and many people for the second one will say hippo instead of rhino. And it was part of the study group for detecting dementia and early Parkinson's, and it happens so much that people say hippo. We wanted to determine whether that was an acceptable response. So we did all this fancy statistical analysis to see if it contributed to whether they actually had dementia or not. And in the end, we came out by saying you can't call it a hippo because it's actually a rhino. So you could go to the next one. So there's a brief memory task, recalling 5 words. You get 2 different trials, some attention tasks. You get the idea, right? It's kind of like being back in school again, but not the kind of test that you got in school. And all we're trying to determine is who needs a closer look in terms of their thinking and cognition. That's the finish of it, so we'll go on from here. This is something that I think you can use across a variety of settings. So in addition to giving people performance-based cognitive tasks, we can also ask family members and friends what they see. Because sometimes people are good enough at testing that they can perform normally on some of these simple tests that we give, but people who know them see problems that we could be picking up on. And so this is one that we use. If we could go forward just one. It's called the Symptoms of Dementia Screener. It's got 11 yes/no questions. It doesn't require any special training. It's for family and friends to fill out. When I'm in clinic, we use it and we just give it to families and ask them to fill it out in the waiting room while the person does their testing. So if you could go forward, they're just a series of questions that are associated with dementia. They can be associated with other things as well. But the point is, if you want to think about when to get an evaluation, the more of these questions that you answer yes to for the person of interest, the more likely it is that you should consider talking with a physician or a healthcare professional. You can skip to the next one. The other 5 questions are there. I know it's quick and no one really reads that fast. But these are 11 questions that we use, and it's very simple, and people know how to respond to them, whether they've been trained or not. It can be very, very helpful. So we use it when we do memory screening days, and we use it when we're evaluating somebody for dementia. And if somebody calls me in my office and wants to know whether somebody should get an evaluation, these are the kinds of things that I'll talk them through. Go ahead. So you might say to me, and many people do, if there's really no cure for Alzheimer's disease and if the treatments aren't that great, why should we even bother talking to a doctor in the first place? So why go to a doctor for something for which there really isn't a great treatment? And I'd like to address that with you because I think it's a really key point, because some people will say this is obviously Alzheimer's disease. There's really not any great treatment, so I'm not even going to go in and talk to a doctor. What difference will it make? So there are a few points here, and some of them are more important than others. Think about the story of my grandfather really quickly. So we didn't have a diagnosis. We didn't bring him in for an evaluation, and we just thought he wasn't hearing very well. We thought he wasn't paying attention. We thought he was a little bit confused, but we certainly didn't want to admit he had Alzheimer's disease. That diagnosis may have offered him a treatment that probably wouldn't change the trajectory of his changes very much, but it would have given us a context for understanding what was happening for him. It would have helped us understand his behavior and why he was doing the things that he was doing. The other thing that's really important is you want to have the other medical conditions treated. So people rarely just have Alzheimer's disease when they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. They also have high blood pressure, they have diabetes, they have certain forms of heart disease. And when you have other medical conditions in addition to Alzheimer's that aren't treated, you function at a lower level. That is well known. So even if we can't reverse the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, we can treat the other medical conditions well enough to give you the best possible functioning that you can. Many people with Alzheimer's disease also experience depression, and you can get treatment for the depression, which will also help you function at a better level than if you're left untreated. And of course, as I've mentioned several times, you can have unneeded medications reevaluated. The geriatricians that I work with, when somebody shows up and gets that diagnosis, they're more likely to take people off medications than to put them on new ones. Go ahead. The other thing is you want to rule out reversible causes. So just because it looks like it's Alzheimer's disease doesn't necessarily mean that it is. There are other things that will mimic the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease which are treatable, and it would be a real serious shame if somebody was experiencing something that was reversible and they never got brought in to see if it was something like that. So vitamin B12 deficiency is something that can lead people to be forgetful and confused. Polypharmacy is just our fancy way of saying too many medications on aging kidneys. It can lead people to be confused and forgetful. Delirium or acute confusional state. My other grandfather went into the hospital perfectly clear in terms of his thinking and memory. He was having a heart procedure. After the surgery, he came out of it incredibly confused, very combative, was pulling out his IVs at 3 in the morning. He was trying to leave the hospital saying he needed to go meet his friends for bowling. He didn't have any sense of what was happening. And the family became very concerned. They said, we think he has Alzheimer's. And I said, well, he didn't have Alzheimer's when he went in. You don't get Alzheimer's after having heart surgery. What he had was delirium, an acute confusional state. So surgery can sometimes cause this. It can be cleared up. Urinary tract infections are a cause of delirium. That's something that can be addressed, and we don't want to just let it go. We want to have it evaluated. There's a variety of conditions. I won't go through all of them. If we could go to the next. The next point I want to make is that understanding how Alzheimer's and having a diagnosis affects people's daily functioning is critical. So once people start to have significant problems with their memory and their cognition, we know that they're at greater risk in their daily functioning for safety issues. So for my grandfather, again, obviously, he was driving when he probably shouldn't. Even if the mechanics of driving were okay for him, he was easily lost, and that really put him at risk. The diagnosis wouldn't necessarily have prevented that, but it would have given us a more informed choice about how we could guide him and take care of him. Maybe we could have arranged rides for him to go to the meeting with the plumbers instead of letting him loose on the roads. Managing money, cooking, remembering to turn off the stove, having good judgment. So when somebody shows up at your front door and tells you that you need a new roof, and they start to work on it and you write them a fat check for $5,000 even though it got replaced 3 years ago, that's a really serious functional implication. The people with Alzheimer's disease, once you know that they're at greater risk for losses in judgment, you can help protect them and take care of them, and the diagnosis helps you do that because it gives you a context for what's happening for their behavior. Go ahead. So some people ask me, when should I push for more assessment, or when do I just need to accept that this is what's happening? And there's a real tension here. So you have to fight through this a little bit for your individual scenario, and this is something that's faced by families who listen to me talk on this and they say, I don't know if it's Alzheimer's or not, and other people say, well, they've told me it is several times. Should I push for more evaluation, or do I need to just accept that this is what's actually happening? Because it is hard to accept. It's a very fearful condition. So there's a couple of things that I would recommend. And again, I'm a psychologist telling you about medical things, so you should talk with your doctor about this. But here are a few things that we see when we work together in a multidisciplinary fashion. And my physician colleagues agree with this typically. So maybe push for more evaluation. If the person isn't getting better, they've never had any type of a brain scan, CT, MRI, to rule out other causes for the memory changes. They've never had any type of cognitive screening, and they've never had labs to rule out reversible causes. For a while, we ran a clinic where we saw the people that physicians couldn't figure out or couldn't take the time to figure out. And I would always ask them, what has your physician done, or what have they told you about the condition? And the most common answer was that we haven't been told anything, And the most common thing that happened was they had a 15-minute office visit where the physician talked to the person, and that was kind of it. So it's hard to know when to push, but it's also important for you to evaluate what's already been done. Have people gone through the steps to be sure that this is what's happening? And you need to consider those in a case-by-case basis. Anytime there's a sudden change, I would definitely check in with your doctor. Even if they have Alzheimer's disease and one day they wake up and they just seem very different, if they're starting to experience behavioral problems, a good chance to check in. Sometimes there can be underlying medical issues that can lead them to be more combative or confused, and you shouldn't try to go that alone and just assume that that's your lot right now. If your physician has never listened to you and never cared to take the time to hear what's going on, that might be a time to push for more evaluation. And I typically recommend, unless you have a really great family doc or internist, that you consider a geriatrician. So one of the issues that we face as we do a better job of detecting and raising awareness about Alzheimer's disease is we're diagnosing it earlier and earlier. So we already said the rates are going up significantly. It's becoming much more common because people are living longer, but people are also living longer with Alzheimer's disease. So the earlier we make the diagnosis, the more years they have with that particular diagnosis. And as the numbers grow and the treatments don't continue to arise, the last FDA-approved medication for Alzheimer's disease was approved in 2003. If you compare that to things like cancer, there were 13 or 14 new medications just last year. So things are moving slowly, and we're left with the question of how do we live with Alzheimer's disease? So having somebody come in and you make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and give them a prescription and shoo them out the door is no longer sufficient, because people don't know what to do next, and people live their lives in between doctor's appointments. And so it's on us to figure out how do we better live with Alzheimer's. So I want to make a couple of quick points, and then we're going to take our quick restroom break before we start the second half. One of the questions that's troubled me for a while as somebody who spends probably way too much time thinking about Alzheimer's disease is, what is it about this condition, other than what we've talked about so far, that makes it so terrifying, right? So there are other conditions out there which are very difficult for people and that the treatment options aren't very good, but there's something about Alzheimer's disease that raises more fear. And when people do surveys asking people over the age of 60 what medical conditions do they fear most, Alzheimer's disease is number one every time. This has changed a bit in the last 10 years. It used to be cancer and then Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's has risen to the top of the list. And some of the points that people have made are really key here, that Alzheimer's is unique because it seems to strike at the very core of who we are. It affects our memories. It affects, in some ways, our relationships. So if your spouse or significant other develops Alzheimer's disease, that really changes the nature of the relationship. It's still your companion, still the person that you love, but you then are starting to take on a caregiving role for them. You're starting to do things for them that they used to be able to do for themselves, and it really makes things quite different, even though the relationship is still between people who love each other. Others have said, we live in a really hyper-cognitive society where we value people who are highly intelligent, have quick wit, they have great self-control, they're ambitious, they've achieved a lot, and that is what Alzheimer's takes from you. So if you have made your name as the CEO of a powerful organization because you were always right on it, those are people who are often most afraid of Alzheimer's disease because what they've built up in terms of their identity is the thing that's going to be robbed from them. The thing that came up for me in clinic in Louisville, Kentucky, and I don't know if it's different here, but there are many church-going people in Louisville, Kentucky, and people wanted to talk about, what does this mean for me in my faith? So they would want to know, what does this mean? What if I forget about God? What if I forget my faith? And what if these people who I've known for all these years in my church start to forget about me? And it quickly becomes an issue of identity. And living with Alzheimer's disease, a very deeply forgetful condition. And so many people are afraid of it because it seems to take away the things that are most dear to them. So what I want to do is take our break here, and we'll come back and start talking about hopefully more hopeful aspects of living with Alzheimer's disease, and we'll pull in more of the faith element, of the faith element, of the faith element, of the faith element, of the faith element. You know, I meant to take a couple of questions before I took the break, but I frankly forgot, and a couple people asked good questions, so I just wanted to address them really quickly, and then I want to get into finding hope. First question had to do with genetic risk and heredity and Alzheimer's disease, and this comes up all the time, and I frankly don't know why I don't include it, because people ask. And so there's an issue here. So many of us, I've already talked about one grandfather who had Alzheimer's disease. Many of you know somebody in your family who maybe had it, and people want to know, does that mean I'm at greater risk? And it isn't a very straightforward answer. We think there are two types of Alzheimer's disease. There is an early onset type, and there is the more typical late onset type. So 95% of cases of Alzheimer's disease occur as the late onset type, late 60s, 70s, 80s. The early onset type, 5% before age 60. So the way to describe the genetic risk is the early onset type, which has the same underlying changes as the late onset type, has a stronger genetic risk. It still doesn't necessarily mean if you have a first-degree relative that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. I don't know how many people I've talked to who are in their middle ages, who are in clinic with a parent with Alzheimer's disease, who naturally assume that they're going to get it because their parent had it and they know that there's some genetic risk. For the late onset type, if you have a first-degree relative, it does increase your risk, but you still have a better chance of living out your days without Alzheimer's than you do with it. So it does increase risk. I have greater risk. Some of you have greater risk. And you have to figure out how you're going to deal with that. But you still have a better chance of not getting it. For the early onset type, there are certain genetic markers that people are starting to look at that people can get tested for to see if they actually have higher risk. And so it kind of depends on what the family history is. There are some families where they have what's called familial Alzheimer's disease, where the disease tends to cluster in a family where, to put it scientifically, a ton of them get it, and those are people who have a much higher risk. But for the late onset type, there's only a small increase in the risk for Alzheimer's disease compared to not having it. Second question had to do with, what do you do with not being able to find your keys or your wallet or your purse, and how do you know when that's starting to be a problem? And the best way I can answer that is twofold. One is the persistence of the problem. If it's happening over and over and over again, that's different than if it happens occasionally. Again, that's not very scientific, but the other part of it I think is more important, is that it's more likely that somebody else is going to notice before you. And that's a difficult thing to deal with, because sometimes we want to be very private and try to hide it. But what I would encourage you to do is think about identifying one person who you trust. And if you think you're at risk for Alzheimer's disease, to ask them to be your eyes and ears, and to bring it to your attention gently if they think you're starting to become forgetful. Because what happens for many people is they knew somebody in their family with Alzheimer's disease, they saw how difficult it was, and they've become very anxious and worried about it. And any time that they forget, they think, oh no, this is it. And they become very hypervigilant to any forgetting. So if you took care of a parent with Alzheimer's and you can't find your keys, most of the time you just couldn't find your keys, but the way that we emotionally respond to that is, I know this just isn't the keys, it's something bigger. And that's why you really need somebody else who will keep an eye out with you, and you can talk to about that. All right, I'll take questions again at the end, but I want to make sure we spend time talking about hope, and this is an area where I've been working a bit more in terms of integrating a Christian faith perspective in Alzheimer's disease. I work at a state university, so I know not everybody believes what Christians believe. But that is going to be the focus of this second half. I respect the differences in what people believe, but that's what I was brought here to talk about today. So if you don't believe similar things, I hope you'll listen and see, what you can take from this particular talk. We've already really highlighted, hopefully, how difficult Alzheimer's can be and how much it seems like it takes from us. Many people are left struggling with where they can find hope, and Scott was already nice enough to mention my book, and one of the things that I did in writing this book was to talk with families who were part of church communities about their experiences with Alzheimer's disease, and talk with them about where they find hope, both in terms of biblical perspectives on Alzheimer's disease and in terms of everyday care. And this is where I want to spend the remainder of our time. So these are 4 sources of hope that really have resonated with Christian caregivers that I've talked to in the course of my study. We'll go through all 4 of them. The first source of hope is God's call to remember Him. The second is that God fully knows us and intercedes on our behalf. Third, He never forgets us. And fourth is God's invitation into the care process. So, the first point that I want to make in terms of hope is that it seems clear to me that God really wants us to remember, and that He will provide ways to do just that. So the other side of this is when we step into this, there can actually be joy in helping people remember. And I hope you'll stick with me because I think it seems overly simplistic, even as I say it out loud, right? I've just highlighted for you how difficult remembering is. And we say, well, God wants us to remember, and He'll provide that way to do it. But we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into this call to remember and what it might look like for us, because it's not maybe what we thought. Go ahead. So one of the things that has struck me over the years, being an Alzheimer's guy is, and also a Bible guy, is how much remembering comes up in the Scriptures. Once you start reading it with an eye toward the theme of remembering, to me it seems like it's everywhere. And we see that God calls His people to remember Him specifically, what He's done for people in the past. So to remember the hardships that God has already brought us through, to remember that He's with us in the current trials, and to remember His promises regarding our future. The way you see it in the Old Testament, you see it in the story of the nation of Israel coming out of oppression in Egypt. If you recall your early Old Testament, you know they came out in a pretty dramatic way. You have the 10 plagues, you have the parting of the Red Sea, all of these things which seem like, wow, if that happened, we never would forget that, right? So those are amazing things, but what you see in that story is they're not into the wilderness for more than several days when Israel has turned, seemingly forgotten what God has done and said, you took us out here to die. Things have gotten so bad, we can't find water, we can't find food. And God's call to them is, remember what I've done. Remember how I've taken you out of that before. And remember, I've promised you this better land in the future. I'm with you now in the pillar of fire and in the cloud. As they go through the wilderness, they eventually get to the brink of the promised land, this great promise, and they get very frightened. You're not going to go through all of the Old Testament, but they send in the spies because they're afraid. And at that point, God again calls them to remember. He said, remember, I took you out of Egypt. I did all these things. And you read the book of Deuteronomy and you see a lot of it is a communal remembering of what they've been through and where they're going. And God calls them to do that, not so that they can measure up to what He wants, so that they will take comfort and they will be encouraged that God goes with them and they don't have to be afraid. In the New Testament, we see different instances of the theme of remembering. We see it when Jesus is about to depart. He's told His disciples the bad news that He's going to go away from them, but then He says, I'm going to send an advocate, a helper, the Holy Spirit, who will help you remember everything that I've taught you so that you can faithfully record it. He shares communion, says, do this in remembrance of me. And God clearly calls us to remember. There's something really important about remembering what He's done and that He's with us and that He promises us something better for the future. So this is the theme that we're working with, but at this point, you probably either think I'm really very cruel or a little bit crazy because I've highlighted how memory is the primary and most significant deficit in Alzheimer's disease. So why would I center hope on remembering? So I want to dig deeper into the memory aspects of Alzheimer's disease because this is a really key and misunderstood area. We know that people with Alzheimer's disease forget, but we don't often focus on what they forget and what they can remember a bit better. So When we looked at those early brains, we saw the blue shading just in the temporal lobes. There's a couple of structures in the brain that are responsible for storing new memories. And these are the areas that are earliest affected in Alzheimer's disease and most severely affected by Alzheimer's disease, an area called the hippocampus. And what that does is it takes information that's rolling around in your brain and your conscious awareness right now, and it stores it into a long-term memory. So for you to remember what I've talked about today, your hippocampus has to store that as a new memory, much like you might save a file on your hard drive of your computer or take a manila folder and put it in a file cabinet. If you don't save that file or you don't take that file and put it in the filing cabinet, when you go back later, you're not going to be able to find it. Right? So you can go to the file cabinet and you can shake it and you can yell at it, you can beat on it, you can search your computer, you can do whatever you want, but if that is not stored, you cannot find it because it isn't there. In the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease, the things that we're talking about, the short-term information, the new events, those are the things that are most difficult to remember because it is the hippocampus that is not functioning well. So when you think about ministering to people with Alzheimer's disease and where you want to go to make them feel most comfortable or most uncomfortable, this has very strong implications. Because when you ask people about recent information, when they've got a damaged medial temporal lobes, the hippocampus, those are the things that they're most likely to have trouble remembering. So we are pretty clear, and we do a pretty good job in terms of Alzheimer's training, highlighting where people are weak. And that is new and recent information. These are the things that are hardest to store, so given that the memories aren't stored, it doesn't really matter if you remind people of them because they weren't stored. So that is something to be aware of. But if we could look at where people are relatively stronger in terms of memory, this gives us it gives us some footing to think about how do we help people remember. And so there are three areas in Alzheimer's disease that people have emphasized in the scientific literature that are relative strengths in terms of memory functioning. We said memory for new information, new learning is most difficult. These are areas that are not as difficult. They're relative strengths, which doesn't mean they are as good as they used to be. But when we look at the amount of change that people experience, it is much less than you see in terms of recent events, conversations, new information. There are three of them. Older autobiographical memories. I can't tell you how many times somebody has said to me in clinic or after a talk like this, why is it that my mother can remember what happened 30 years ago like it was yesterday, but she can't remember what she had for breakfast or that she has a doctor's appointment tomorrow? It's because that memory, that older autobiographical memory, which is psychologists speak for people's stories of long ago, those are older stored memories, and those are relative strengths. These are places that we can go with people where they have a better sense of mastery and they can really fully engage. Second is procedural memory. Procedural memory is a memory for habits and skills that we've done so many times that we don't even have to think about them. So when you think about when people say, it's like riding a bike. Well, that's a good example of procedural memory because you don't walk up to a bike and say, no, what do I do? I have to step over, I've got to put my, you don't go through those steps. You walk up to a bike and it's like riding a bike. Your body just knows what to do. That's a procedural memory. There are other examples, but that's the clearest. That is something that is relatively spared in Alzheimer's disease. And finally, emotional memory, which is something we're learning a bit more about. It's memory for emotionally significant events from long ago, typically, but it's also a memory for the way things felt. And there's some new experimental evidence that suggests that in certain situations, sometimes people with Alzheimer's disease, even when they can't remember what specifically happened, they will remember the way it made them feel. And I think there are very strong implications for the way that we take care of people tapping into emotional memory. So even if somebody doesn't necessarily remember your name or what you did when you visited them, they may have a trace of memory for the way that you made them feel, and that has a lot of implications for the way we approach people. So my question for you to consider briefly before I start to explain it in more detail is, how do you use these things? So if you are involved in a ministry, or if you're a chaplain, or if you do some form of counseling, or if you're providing activity care for people, how do you draw upon these forms of memory to help people remember? And I will say, it isn't by asking them if they remember, right? So this is a more subtle prompting of remembering. Go ahead, the next one. So the first thing is we engage people's stories of faith. So when you're a younger person and you're around people who are older, you kind of think, why are people always talking about their stories from long ago? And why do people tell them over and over? Well, in the context of Alzheimer's disease, one reason that people do that is because that's something that they remember very well. Do you want to talk about things where you feel a little bit uncertain and confused, or do you want to talk about things that are really key to who you are and your story, and the things where you can actually join in? So if you want to love somebody with Alzheimer's well, don't ask them about the details of what happened yesterday or what happened earlier this morning. Engage them in their life stories. Allow them to tell it whatever way they want, right? So people are going to tell their stories differently. They may repeat themselves more often. They may be less linear than they used to be. Listen to what they're trying to say, not to the actual words of what they're saying. Sometimes when people tell their story, it gets a bit confusing. Maybe you can't follow it. Try to listen for the theme of what they're saying and help them fill in the details, even if you do it silently in your head. Engaging people's stories, especially their stories of faith in the context of church care, can be a really grace-filled activity. Try to avoid, as much as possible, I think it comes naturally for many of us, starting the conversation with, do you remember? Because that is an area that is more difficult for them, so start it in other ways. If it's somebody that you know well, you can start it with, I remember that you used to do these things, and then allow them to join in as they like. But try to avoid those three words, do you remember? The various stages that you might see in terms of somebody's life review, childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, you already knew these were the stages of life. But I put them up there because it emphasizes to you that you don't have to just talk about what recently happened. Think through those various stages and move around a bit to try some of them. These are some sample questions. Frankly, you don't need sample questions. What you really need is just to be genuine in being patient and wanting to hear what people have to say. So we can skip ahead. So sometimes people will get to a stage where they really can't tell their story very well anymore. Either their communication has been affected, or they just don't have an interest. And one of the things that you can do that's loving is to tell people stories for them, or to give them various prompts. I know this is something that the Spirit Alive program does very, very well. One of the caregivers that I interviewed in my book, she was very upset because she could no longer care for her mother at home, and she had to move her into a nursing home, and she was very devastated. She felt incredibly guilty, which is something caregivers feel a lot. But when she was cleaning out all her mother's things, she used it as an opportunity to put together her mother's life story, and she made her several books where she had key pictures throughout her life. She found poems that her mother had recorded that she really loved. She found Bible verses that her mother had loved, and she put them together in these really beautiful books, and she gave them to her mother. And each time she looked at them, it was as if she had not seen it before, but it prompted these memories for different aspects of her life. She put her marriage certificate in it. It was a really beautiful thing, so she didn't ask her mother to tell her about those things, but she gave it to her so that she could silently go through it and remember in a time that was very confusing and uncertain. So you can use multiple sensory modalities, smells, sounds, music, photographs. All of these can help prompt remembering. It isn't foolproof. That's nothing I'm talking about is a surefire method to help people remember. You're stepping in love, putting them in a position that maximizes their opportunity to remember something about their story and why it's important. As a side note, you'll find that a lot of the memories that people want to talk about are from adolescence and early adulthood. We call that the reminiscence bump. It happens in Alzheimer's disease, it happens in normal aging. It's just a time in life where a lot is happening. There's a lot of brain development happening there. So if you ask people to recall things freely, it's likely they'll go there on average. Second is to draw upon procedural memory. Sometimes church services get criticized because they're very repetitive. We do the same things over and over, week to week. We think we always have to do something new. But it turns out that for people with Alzheimer's disease, being repetitive and doing many of the things over and over can actually be a good thing. So this is an area where I think it makes a big difference if you understand somebody's individual faith story and what type of church they went to, what kind of congregation it was. Because what you want to do is to draw upon those procedural memory systems, those things that they've gone through so many times before that they can even remember them without consciously intending to. So even in the span of Christian churches, some people are up and dancing in the aisle in a service, and some people are sitting incredibly quiet, not daring to speak or even look like they might be raising their hand. Those are two very different types of worship experiences, and understanding where people can come from or where they're coming from can really maximize their opportunity to remember. So liturgy is one area where people, if they've used a consistent liturgy throughout their life, might prompt a remembering. Music is the most common example. So I get letters fairly often, people telling me about how they visited their mother in a nursing home, and they were at a worship service and it looked like mom was sleeping the whole time. The pastor or the chaplain did a little sermonette and the person just looked like they were out of it. But then an old song came on, and the hand went up and they look closely and see that they're mouthing each word. That's an aspect of our procedural memory. It's also an evidence of God's grace in that moment. But it's drawing upon, those are songs that are so deeply embedded, we don't even have to think about them. We start to sing them when we engage. Familiar scripture, my other grandfather, the one who didn't have Alzheimer's but had delirium, eventually did go on to develop Alzheimer's. And he did not go into it as gently as my plumber grandfather. The mechanic grandfather became very, very combative, very confused, and he ended up in a secure memory facility. Won't forget the story of the pastor going to visit him. Thought he'd been a part of this church, he had been a deacon and was a really key part. The pastor showed up and said, "Adrian, do you remember who I am?" First question. So that visit was over right away. He kicked him out of the room, which he was not hesitant to do. And so the pastor says to my grandma, what should I do? She said, "You're the pastor, you figure it out." And I thought that was a pretty good answer. He was young and he was new. He didn't really have a lot of experience. He could have learned a lot from our chaplain colleagues. But he came back and he did get a bit more creative, and he sat down with my grandfather and started to read Psalm 23 with him. And my grandfather gave no indication of wanting to do anything with this man. He didn't frankly know who he was. He was a new pastor and he didn't have any experience with him. But what he did was he started out reading, "The Lord is my," and then he just waited. And sure enough, combative, confused grandfather is my shepherd. He fills it in. And the pastor continued on. He'd read a little bit and let him fill in. And they went back and forth like that. And this was something that is not only an instance of remembering. This is a really key passage for very many people, but it's also something that he knew very well. I don't know if he read it in the King James or not, but if he had, that would have prompted a stronger memory, I would suspect, than using a newer edition for him, because that's what's embedded deep within his procedural memory systems. And that's not just an evidence of grace, that's a great encouragement to a family to say, yeah, he's still there and he's still able to respond in that particular way, even if it doesn't work the next time. That's not really what it's about. Well-known prayers, it's not uncommon to find somebody, one chaplain that I know was talking to me about a woman who, again, was very combative on the unit, and she knew that this woman had been a very faithful Catholic, and so what she tried was the next time the woman was screaming, she walked up to her and handed her the rosary, and the woman immediately started praying through it. So the staff from that unit, whenever she started to become upset, would bring it out and hand it to her, and she would start praying through it. And it's not a care technique. It's just ministry to the person that you know a bit about their background, and you step in to try to reach them. Physical reminders, communion. there's a variety of different things that we can do that tap into our procedural memory systems. Many people have taken communion so many times that when the elements are put in front of them, it prompts a remembering. It's not foolproof, just like everything I've put up here. It doesn't work every time, but we're stepping in love to try to see what might work and helping them respond. Go to the next. Yep. Did you? Oh, you did already. Yeah. Like, why isn't he doing that? He already did. Thank you for not going to the next one. So, okay. So the next thing that we should do is less of a technique, and it is simply about slowing down and being present with people who are forgetful. And I don't know specifically if this taps into the aspects of emotional memory that I already talked about, but taking the time to love and honor people and slowing down, recognizing their worth and their value, showing them honor and respect is a really critical aspect to any type of spiritual care, whether you have dementia or not. But especially in the context of dementia, it just takes more time. So slow down, be present, pray with them, pray for them, pray for guidance before you go in. We never go alone, hopefully, when we're seeking to minister to other people. They're not going to initiate the contact as much as they used to, so it's our job to initiate and invite people in. And if they don't want any part of it, we need to respect that, but it's our job to continue to move forward toward them and just slow down and be with them. Incidentally, I'm not talking much about caregivers today, but when I talked with caregivers about what churches could do to better minister to them, this was the number one answer, was presence. They over and over said, I just wish that people in my church would stay present on the journey with me. One caregiver said, I would just die for a phone call. Just one phone call, check in to see how I'm doing. So presence goes a long way. If you think of the story of Job, when you read the story of Job closely, his miserable friends were really good ministers the first couple of days, where they just went and they sat with him and were present with him in the suffering. It was when they tried to think of the right thing to say that they screwed up. And I think we can learn a lot from that. So these are just brief remembrances. They're sacred moments where something happens. You know, whether it's somebody responds to a particular song or a passage, or they have that moment with somebody where it's just something is very real. And we need a real shift in our paradigm for dementia care, because that moment matters. We're not going to do a clinical trial where we find that if we continue to do this over 6 months, a year down the road, we're going to see better quality of life. That may not happen. Maybe it would. But what we're hoping for is to put people in a position where they feel that connection with you and with God. And even if they can't tell you about it later, even if they can't reflect upon what happened, that momentary remembrance continues to matter. And I think that's what we need to be shooting for, because those individual moments that make up our consciousness and our reality are part of what defines our experience. So if we only shoot for enduring change that people can tell us about later, we're going to be very frustrated and discouraged. So focus on the moment, and when it happens, celebrate it, thank God for it, but don't ask the person to tell you about it the next day, because they may not remember it, and that is frankly okay, in my opinion. Try to keep in mind this isn't a series of techniques that what works one day works the next. Second piece of hope is that, you know, you may be listening to this and say, well, that's fine, but isn't there a point for some of these people where they don't respond to those things in the same way that they used to? And one of the things, the second piece of hope that I want to talk about is, even when people reach that point where it doesn't seem like they're responding to what we do, maybe sometimes we can't feel like we can even reach or understand what's going on in them, there's hope in that they are still fully known by God and that He holds on to them. Go ahead. This is what I was looking for. So this is a quick note that was written to me while I was writing my book. This was a woman who was caring for her husband, and she wrote this to me. Basically, this is what she said. She wanted for her husband male companionship. She said she wanted to have 1 or 2 men visit him and show an interest in who he was and who he is. Perhaps take him for a ride or something. Give him time with trusted friends who understand his situation and don't always ask questions needing an answer. Who speak slowly, articulate clearly, and aren't in a hurry. This is touching on some of the things we just talked about with presence. men who will pray with him and know how to talk about something other than sports, politics, or business, men who can affirm his accomplishments and contributions and give him respect, men who care. I would rather have someone minister to him than to try to meet my needs. I'll manage, but time is slipping away from him. This is a man and his wife who they had been missionaries across the globe. They had worked as Bible translators. They did incredible work. And she was really just looking for somebody to come and be with him and recognize his humanity and to be with him. And I read this and I was so struck by it. I thought, I have to meet this guy and I want to go see, what is this family like? And so I drove. They're on the outskirts of Louisville, a pretty rural area, and I was very excited to meet him. And I went in and she greeted me. She was a very warm and gentle woman. And I went to introduce myself to him and he just stared straight ahead. And he never acknowledged I was there. And she spoke to him and she tried to say things to him and he never responded. He groaned a little bit. And I was just very struck because this was a man who had progressed to a point in his dementia where he really didn't speak anymore. And he really didn't respond to anything that I tried to say to him. And he really just, as I said, just occasionally had a groan. And it just struck me how we can try some of these things we talk about in terms of remembering, but when you hit that point, I thought, how painful is this for this woman and her husband living alone out here, somewhat isolated, and she doesn't know what's going on internally for him anymore. Is he content or is he suffering? Is he lonely? What is going on inside his heart? And one of the difficulties of dementia is sometimes we have to face those situations where we really don't know what's going on in the person. We don't know what that internal experience is like. And so that hope that I'm talking about is the hope that even when we can't know people, they are still fully known. And I know this violates all principles of good PowerPoint by putting too much on here, but I wanted to share a few thoughts from Psalm 139, which is quickly becoming one of my favorite passages. Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, Lord, you know it completely. One of the things I love about Psalm 139 is it reminds us that God knows us better than we even know ourselves. And even if we've taken care of somebody and known them for 60, 70 years, God knows them at a depth and level that we could never comprehend. Go to the next one. This is just pieces of Psalm 139. It's not the whole thing. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, and your right hand will hold me fast. What a comfort that must be to know that when we can't know what's going on, that God continues to know and he holds on to his people. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. We are fully known even when others can no longer know us. But it doesn't stop there. So it's one thing to be known by God. If you could go to the next one. God doesn't stop there. If we go to Romans 8, again, violating PowerPoint principles, but I think we can make an exception for Romans 8. We know that it isn't just that God fully knows us, but that he intercedes on our behalf in prayer. So we know that the whole creation has been groaning and is in the pains of childbirth right up until the present time. And this man clearly knew that groaning, longing for a better day. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies, and I would add, our brains. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. And this is the part that I really want to emphasize. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So it's one thing to be fully known. It's another thing to have the Holy Spirit interceding based upon that full knowledge of us on our behalf. That if The Holy Spirit knows us so deeply and knows those needs better than we can know them for each other, and prays for them. We go to the next one. The final piece of this is that even if we're very, very forgetful, that God is not, and he promises to never forget us. The passage here from Isaiah 49. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, which seems hard to imagine, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hand. You go to the next one, Scott. We also find comfort in knowing that even in our forgetting, God does not forget us. He continues to know us, and if you think about it, it's far more significant that God would remember us than that we remember him, because his grace is about what he has done and not what we can do. And that's important in dementia, where we lose the things that we can do. So nothing, not even the ravages of dementia, the plaques and tangles in our brain, as we're told in Romans 8, can separate us from the love of God. So if you could go next. So here we are in Alzheimer's disease, and we have these promises from Scripture. God continues to know us. He intercedes on our behalf. We can't be separated from his love. Even if we're very forgetful, he'll never forget us. And one of the things that's clear is that Alzheimer's is so difficult that for many it raises a crisis of faith. And so we ask ourselves, do we believe these things that we've been promised? When God asks us to remember, what has he done in the past? His presence right now. What are his promises? Do we believe them? So do we believe that God can reach this man in his silence even deep into dementia? Do we believe that God has provision in his grace for this man? Do we believe that God will sustain him till the end? Do we believe that God can, do we believe the great shepherd continues to know his sheep? Do we believe that the sheep know his voice and that no one can snatch those sheep from his hand? Do we believe that God will continue the good work that he began in us? Essentially, is God going to be there for us deep into dementia? And do we believe that he does search our hearts and prays on our behalf and intercedes based upon our greatest inner needs? And do we believe that we really can't be separated from his love? You know, when we ask these questions, you can go to the next one there. If we believe these things, then in faith, and we said it's faith for things that we do not yet see, we have hope. And when we have hope, we can step in love. Because the reality is, no matter how much you know about dementia, no matter how much you read, no matter how much you experience, you're going to run into situations where you just don't know what to do. And it's going to be awkward and it's going to be hard. And I showed up at this guy's door thinking, I know a good amount about Alzheimer's disease. I would love to be one of those guys who visits with him. And I was completely humbled by the silence of dementia. Because it's not about me, it's about what God is able to do. So when we have a situation like this or something simpler, we have to remember we don't go alone. There's a call for us to remember in community. And I did go back to see that man, and he and his wife, or his wife and I talked about what we might do. And again, it's about putting people in a position to remember. And so we tried to get him to tell some of his story. She gave a surefire, he'll want to talk about this time where he was a little kid and he drove his go-kart to town and the police arrested him and brought him home, but he nothing, right? He didn't give us anything. And so we agreed that we would try communion with him. He had been a pastor and a missionary, and she had some bread and wine, and she helped him through it. So I read the communion passage with him, do this in remembrance of me, and we walked through it, and she broke off the bread and gave it to him, and he took it. It took a long time. It was very, very slow. And it was really kind of unclear, what it meant to him. But she asked him, she said, do you want to pray? And he did. He started to pray. But his prayer was one word. So he bowed his head and he folded his hands and he just said, Jesus. But then he finished and he looked at me. And we had just done this communion. He just looked at me and he said one more word. And he just said, brother. And this was a time where I tried all my dementia techniques, and they didn't work. But when I step in and say, I don't go alone, the Spirit is working in this man's life, can I go in and just try to minister to him? It isn't something he's going to tell anybody about later, but in that moment, did God reach him and give him a remembrance of him and his presence in his life. There we go. If we could step forward. So what we're really talking about here is a very general framework. So if you don't believe the things of the Christian faith and you want to say, how does this apply? Really, we're talking about three things. We're talking about planning care based on knowledge of the person, that individual, specific person. Something about their life, what they believe, what's important to them, who's important to them. We compensate for their weaknesses in memory, and we build on any existing strengths. Go forward one more. So the last source of hope has to do with those of us who aren't experiencing dementia, but who might provide care. And I think it's important for us to recognize that the work that we do, whether a family caregiver, a professional caregiver, really is very important and it matters. We might not ever get thanked for it, but it is really critical. And I think that the scriptures tell us, not specifically for Alzheimer's disease, obviously, but that when we step in to love people in a sacrificial way, that we're doing kingdom work. If we look at the life of Jesus, which we're encouraged to imitate in the scriptures, the scriptures tell us all the universe was made through Jesus Christ, but then he also turned around and washed his disciples' feet, which had to be one of the most unpleasant tasks. They smelled bad. It's a real humbling of yourself to love somebody in a sacrificial way, and that was just a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice that he gave in terms of giving up his life. So when we love sacrificially, we imitate Christ and we step into this kingdom work. One caregiver wrote this to me about the sacrificial love of caregiving. She said, "One morning I awakened and I heard, 'Some minister to thousands and some minister to one.' I instinctively knew that familiar, still small voice of the Holy Spirit. He was telling me that my life and service unto the Lord and my loved one was significant." And she took great encouragement that though her husband wasn't necessarily recognizing all that she did, that God recognized what it was and that it mattered. So one of the things that it brings up is the passage in Matthew 25, which I won't read to you in the complete form, but it's essentially where people are standing before Jesus one day and he says, "Come you who, I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me." And they say, "When did we do all those things for you?" And he says, "Whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." So when we think about caregiving, what might Jesus say to those of you who are providing care for someone you love? "When I was forgetful, you remembered me. You answered my anxious questions, even though I had asked them many times already. When I was lost, you helped me find my way. You helped take care of my money and gave me medications when I couldn't. When I lost my judgment, you kept me safe. You even changed my clothes and helped me bathe." The point here is that those things that we do that no one sees, or the things that you do that no one sees and no one thanks you for, are not going unnoticed. So Jesus may say to you one day, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me." So we already mentioned I have a book. If we could skip forward in the interest of time, I'm not going to say more. If you have questions that we don't get to today, here's my contact information. We'll leave it up at the end so you can write it down because I'm closing on time. I want to say one more thing because I know that whenever I give these talks that somebody is facing Alzheimer's disease or is worried that they have it. And I just want to close with a word of encouragement for you, though I recognize that what you're facing is very, very difficult. Now, these are the 4 points that I want to say is that if you're facing Alzheimer's disease today, you can be confident that God will be with you. It won't always feel like it, but you can be confident that he promises that he will, that he'll provide what you need each day, just like the Israelites when they were in the desert and God gave them manna. He gave them enough just for that day. And he actually told them, "Don't take any for tomorrow, just take what you need today." God will provide it. He will remember and hold on to you. And he will continue to intercede until you are fully restored. If we could go to the very last slide. One of the things that is true about Alzheimer's is that it doesn't get the last word. So it does characterize the end of some of our lives. But recall that we've been promised that the groaning of creation is going to result in a newer creation that is better than this one, that will outweigh the suffering that we experience here. If I could just close from a couple of verses from Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, or Alzheimer's, or forgetting, or agitation, or apathy. All of these things will be wiped away, because the old order of things is passing away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." There's not a lot I can say that changes the reality that this life is full of difficulty, but this is one of the promises that God is calling us to remember. Thank you. So I have time for questions. Scott, could you just put it on the contact information so people can write that down? And thank you. Questions? Yes, sir.
Could you say more, like with your grandfather?
Yes.
Between that later stage, where it just broke off, and kind of where people are cognizant, or they realize that something is happening to them. There are a number of folks
Yeah.
that are starting to realize that there are some changes, become fearful.
Yes.
Outside seems to be an unsafe place. How do we help people in that area?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, sir.
Could you briefly restate?
Yeah, thank you. I'll do that. We're recording this, so I'm going to try to briefly restate the question. Now this also just became a memory test for me as well. So I understand the question as how do we work with people across the stages of dementia with where some people show an awareness and a recollection that they've been diagnosed, and other people, frankly, do not. And I was starting to say that's a good question, and that's a hard question. One of the things that I think of with this type of question is that we have been led to believe that people with Alzheimer's disease lack awareness quite broadly, right? And that they don't really recognize that something is going on. And I think there's two parts to that. So one is, I think we have to be able to engage the underlying fear surrounding Alzheimer's disease, because there are many people who are aware that something is different, but they will do anything that they can to not talk about it because it's so frightening. And when we're afraid, one of the quickest routes to reduce that fear is avoidance. And so one of the things that I think of in terms of approaching people, and hopefully you take from the talk today that everybody is going to be a little bit different, but is to try to engage a level of empathy about how terrified people can actually be. And I don't think you have to go up to them and confront them about their Alzheimer's disease, but approaching them with a sense of empathy that this is very difficult and they might not be prepared to talk about it. And then also recognizing that there are other people who frankly don't know that they have it, even though they did. And the last talk I did like this, there was a woman who came up and basically asked me and said, what do you do when they've been diagnosed and they haven't been told? Should I tell him? And you have to take that case by case as well, but I do believe that everybody deserves to know. The problem is, what do you do when they forget that they've been diagnosed? Do you continue to tell them? And my opinion is you have to pick when you're going to try to do that, but I don't think you have to continue to confront people with it over and over. I don't know if I even came close to answering what you wanted, but those were some of the thoughts that came to mind. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Part of my job at my church is to visit the elderly. And what I notice is some days when I visit, someone may have more memory. The next time, they may have very little memory. They'll remember me one time, the next time they will.
Yes.
Why is that up and down cycle?
that's one of the mysteries, right? So, yes, thank you for reminding me. So, why is it that when you visit somebody one day, they might be able to remember who you are, and the next time they don't seem to remember? And it is one of the mysteries of the dementias. There are some forms of dementia that fall more into that daily variation category. So dementia with Lewy bodies is known to have much wider swings in terms of people having somewhat normal days and then other days where they function much lower. But I don't think we really know in the case of Alzheimer's disease what explains why somebody seems clearer once in a while. I think we can't explain it, but we can take advantage of it in a good way. That if they're clearer, we can step into it in a different way than when they're not. And you know, one of the times this comes up is when somebody, you know, all caregiving relationships that are in the context of family occur in a long-term relationship. And many times people didn't get to say certain things to a loved one before they went into the stages of dementia, and now they really want to find this time to apologize for something that they did or to talk about something very difficult. And one of the things that we encourage people to do is to look for times to say some things that they wanted to say, especially if they're affirming, encouraging things to say. Maybe you're thanking somebody for the things that they did. But you know, I had a pastor approach me about this a while back, and you know, essentially what I encouraged him to do, given that he was a man of faith, was to pray for opportunities to be able to say some things that he wanted to say to his mother. And I encouraged him to focus on things that would give her life rather than trying to confront her for things that maybe hurt him in the past. But I think you watch for those, and then you take them in small drops. You say a little bit and see how they respond. You don't have to unload it all at once. A little bit at a slow pace. Oh, hi.
Do you have any advice on how to deal with the anger that a person who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or even any form of dementia, and they're very angry with usually the people they're most dependent upon? And any advice on how those people who are being, you know, who are feeling that anger toward them can cope?
Yes. So the question was, how do you deal with the anger issues in Alzheimer's disease? You know, how can you help people deal with those, right?
Well, yeah, how do you help people who are the caregivers?
Yes. So how do you help the caregiver deal with those anger issues? Let me offer a few thoughts. So one is, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm not a really angry guy, I'm going to say that. But if I haven't eaten, and if I haven't slept well, and I've had a really bad day, I'm much more likely to explode and become very angry. I think I'm not the only one who feels that way, right? Okay, at least a couple people are like me out there. So, and so when I think about how do you help people cope with the problems of anger in Alzheimer's disease, that is a very small example of how the underlying physiological and emotional state influences our propensity to express high levels of anger, right? So when you have somebody with Alzheimer's disease, if you have great difficulty with memory, all kinds of things are happening around you that you're not quite sure why they're happening because you can't remember the events leading up to them. So your moment-to-moment reality is a bit more confusing. You're also living under the burden of Alzheimer's disease, which causes very significant changes in your ability to function. So it's akin to the situation where we feel a certain sense of physiological deprivation in terms of sleeping, eating, we're hungry, we're grouchy, and then we blow up at somebody and we think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. I didn't, you know, later on we think, how did I get so angry? But when people are living under that burden, they're more likely to have that type of a response because the reality around them is much harder to understand. And not only that, oftentimes we are trying to remind people of things that we already said. We're often doing things in terms of the care that they don't fully understand why we're doing because they may not recognize what their need for care is. So my approach to it is to start with a perspective of empathy. So what must it be like if you are always having people say, are you ready for your doctor's appointment? Hurry, we got to make it to the doctor's appointment. And you're pretty sure that there's no doctor's appointment because you have no memory for it whatsoever. And I think we get a lot of mileage about putting ourselves in the shoes of people with Alzheimer's disease and showing a little bit of grace in terms of that response. The other thing to consider is sometimes the behavioral challenges in Alzheimer's disease can be prompted by underlying unmet needs, things that we haven't recognized. So sometimes people are in pain and they're not able to express it in a way that they used to, or they're frustrated and they can't get the words out. And there's a lot that can be going on under the surface that makes them more likely to blow up at other people. The third thing that I want to say about it is sometimes what you experience in Alzheimer's disease is a continuation and an exacerbation of underlying problems that were there before. So sometimes you've had somebody who's been kind of angry for a good long time, and then they get Alzheimer's disease, and it seems just that much worse. And so part of it there is recognizing some of this is long-term and some of this is the Alzheimer's disease, and it's put together to become worse. And there are other people who go the opposite direction. They were very angry, and now the Alzheimer's has made them much more content. As with many of these things, it's very hard to predict which way it's going to go. But when I talk with families about those types of issues, where I really want to start is try to understand things from their perspective as much as we can. It's a bit of an unknown. And then see what we can do in terms of manipulating the environment to maybe make it less stressful, to slow it down, consider the temperature, the comfort of the home. All of those things can make it more likely to happen. Yeah, Scott?
That makes me also think about grief, the grief of the caregivers.
Yes.
Grief of even pastors who have known somebody a long time, and then you begin to lose them sort of slowly.
Yeah.
So sort of grief of the person, even who, knows they can't remember now.
Yes.
So is a word about grief, support,
Yeah.
and how to balance expression of grief?
Yes.
And the hope you talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about grief for the caregiver and grief in the person with dementia. And it's interesting that you asked that. I had a doctoral student who worked with me a few years ago, and she wanted to study the issue of anticipatory grief, which is grief that people experience anticipating something down the road. And she studied in the context of dementia caregiving to try to measure and understand the extent to which caregivers were already grieving for losses they've experienced, whether it's loss of future plans they had together, or loss of intimacy, or the anticipated losses down the road. And what really surprised us is that the grief issues were very, very common, but they were also one of the strongest predictors of whether people felt a sense of burden in their caregiving and even higher levels of depression. And so I think one of the things that we overlook as healthcare providers, and maybe the chaplains do it better than we do, probably so. I've learned a lot from my chaplain colleagues in this process. But part of what we do when we make a diagnosis and we start to work with individuals with Alzheimer's disease is we neglect those emotional needs of the family. And we may assess their ability to take care. We might assess what needs they have to help provide care in the home, or whether they need another form of housing. But we don't often give them the space to express how afraid and how sad and how angry and how guilty they are. And so one of the things that I think we can do is allow them that space. It's challenging when you don't have a lot of time, right? So if you're working in a primary care setting, that's hard. But we need to know that if we don't allow that to happen, it really influences not only their well-being, but it also interferes with our ability to work collaboratively with them, because oftentimes they haven't had anybody who's willing to listen to what this is like. And to me, it's about providing time and space for them to be able to do that, and the person with dementia as they're able and willing. Again, some people are able, but they don't want to. And I think we have to respect that. Yes?
Is there any correlation in terms of Alzheimer's or general brain health? I think of like luminosity.com.
Yes,
very,
yes.
very popular, right? Improve
Right.
memory. But I'm thinking in general, are things like playfulness or learning to play a new instrument or things like proper sleep and managing stress, how much do these things go into being helpful?
Yes, yes. So the question is, how much do, maybe the question behind the question is, how much can we really prevent or delay Alzheimer's through what we do and how well we take care of ourselves? Somebody asked me about this before I came up as well. It's a really common question. It is a really important question, right? Because as I said, the medicines we currently have are not what we had hoped for. So how can we prevent? It looks like the answer so far is that we can't fully prevent Alzheimer's. Fighting flies. We can't fully prevent it, but maybe we can delay the onset for some people. And so if you could buy an additional 2 to 3 years without it, that would be a major win, right? So what the research currently suggests, and I talk about it in my book in a chapter on prevention, but there's also there's a couple of papers that were put out by consensus panels from the NIH on prevention of cognitive decline and dementia. So they reviewed all of the science that was currently out there at the time, and not surprisingly, the best that we have comes down to those things that you mentioned. So I would call them common sense living. So whatever you can do that's good for your heart is also good for your brain. So good cardiovascular health. So if you smoke, you should probably stop. If you have high blood pressure, diabetes, you want to have them well managed. A heart-healthy diet, physical exercise, social engagement, staying socially active with people you know and love. Don't withdraw to the extent that you can avoid that. But then this issue of the mental cognitive stimulation, right? That is the hot topic because that's a big business right now. And so the other form of this question is, should I do crossword puzzles? Should I do Sudoku? And there is some evidence that cognitive stimulation is helpful in delaying the onset of cognitive changes. The question is, how powerful is that effect, and is it powerful enough for you to spend a lot of your days doing things that you hate, right? So I don't understand why crossword puzzles are fun. And this is not about me and crossword puzzles. But here's what I think. The people who really look at this closely will say a couple of things. And so the effect is not so powerful that you should do it if it's something that's aversive to you, if you just don't enjoy it. If you love crossword puzzles, you should definitely do them because it is a good form of cognitive stimulation. If you like Lumosity and you think it's fun and you can afford it, you should do it. But what the evidence is for things like Lumosity is that you can get better on the tasks that Lumosity taps into. So it's a series of cognitive tasks. I haven't done it personally, but I know the literature a bit. You can get better on those things. But the question is, do those transfer to everyday functioning, right? So if you get better on the memory task that is a part of the software or the program or the app, does that translate to better memory in everyday life? And this has been the biggest challenge of cognitive training studies for decades. We can always boost performance on specific tasks, but does it benefit everyday functioning? So my advice to you is you should definitely find ways to be cognitively stimulated regardless of age and regardless of whether you have dementia or not. But please try to find them in things that you already enjoy doing and that are life-giving, because otherwise you're putting yourself through a lot of frustration for a dubious benefit. So stimulated, but also enjoyment is important. And so you have to individualize that task.
Well, we're out of time.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much, Ben, for being with us.